Thanks, Maria. So I recently exited my company of 12 years, had a successful exit, which was great. But as you can imagine, that is a little bit discombobulating. So I have started a school for digital craftsmanship, as Maria mentioned. And we are addressing essentially the need for meeting this gap in the market right now. Universities, which we love and we're in favor of, it takes too long, 4 years in many cases, to find out that you might want to be a user-centered designer, for instance. And then another 2 years to get a master's. And those people are incredibly well educated and incredibly valuable to the market. But for many of us here, those of us who ended up in UX, I would venture to say it was a very random path. And so that was definitely the case for me as well. I'm an English major by trade, and so essentially interloping in the design community as well. So we're not here to talk about that. That would be creating the future of education. We're here to talk about the future of design. And the first thing I would like to suggest, I'd also like to be the first person to walk across the stage to the other side to keep your interest. When you get the call, and many of you will become successful designers to the point that Maria will want you on the stage, and somebody like Lishan will be feeding her names, and you'll wonder why you got the call, and you'll get it, and she'll suggest a variety of topics, and one of them might be something like the future of design. And this will sound like a really good idea when you're on the phone, and the minute you hang up, what the fuck have I done? Because I'm in front of a room full of designers. Design is creating the future. We are making that future, and you end up getting caught in this terrible recursive loop, which is gut-wrenching until you realize, well, maybe I can figure this out. I've had a few hunches over the course of my career, so let's give this a whirl. So we can essentially establish a North Star, I would call it, with this concept of craftsmanship, and I'll be touching on that throughout the conversation today. It is design essentially infused with an ethos, I would say. Craftsmanship can provide us with a sense of higher meaning for what we're doing. It can provide us with a framework for making decisions as we go through some of the ambiguities of the designs that we're trying to figure out. I think we've nipped around the edges of a lot of that in the conversations today. And I think we can find our way to a new set of elements, human elements, that can provide essentially, again, a framework or components that we can manipulate, a language that we can manipulate. And that would be tremendous, right? We're trying to figure this out through all kinds of different means. So look back to look forward first, right? There's the Renaissance. I don't mean to romanticize it or glorify it, but the Renaissance provided us with a few standards for figuring things out, especially because they were going through some pretty transformative times themselves. At that time, you had the explosion of print media, which, I don't know if a lot of you know this, but it was worried at the time that a novel would drive people insane because it was unheard of to spend that much time focused on one particular thing. We had the emergence of the sciences founded in observation, which was crucial. And you had this financial structure supported by the Medicis and others, which allowed for the arts and humanities to flourish. So that particular setup provided a fertile ground for a lot of great things to happen. And of course, again, you can romanticize this period of time. That being said, the Medicis and a number of other folks kind of corrupted themselves. The financial markets collapsed in many similar ways to what we've experienced over the last few years. And we were left with the history of what the Renaissance was, as opposed to that thing continuing on. But what we got were a series of trades, and the trades focused on the materials they manipulated. So the trades included things like the armorers and the leather makers and so forth, and those folks were defined by the things they made, right? They organized around the things they made. And so as they were setting themselves up from apprentices to craftsmen, to journeymen, to master craftsmen, to grandmasters, they were creating essentially a structure that they could understand to learn from one another, their obligations to each other, and so forth. Amongst these guilds, if you will, was an organization of alchemists. The alchemists were the scientist philosophers of their time. They were well respected, and they were thought to be finding our way to new innovations. The alchemists believed there were 4 elements, and they attempted to manipulate these 4 elements, and again, I'm simplifying here, but they attempted to manipulate these elements in order to do things like mutate metals and so forth, right? And again, they were perceived as the scientists and the makers of their time. However, the science of observation and the lack of proof in their results started to pull apart essentially these group of alchemists until they were seen as kind of a parody. That being said, with all due respect, I would like to suggest that we may be the alchemists of our time, not because we're trying to be, but because we don't know what we need to know yet. We don't fully understand the materials or the elements we're manipulating. And this has come up in a few of the conversations post-presentation today. This is a map, a beautiful map, of the user-centered design process, one of many, but it's a process. And what I find really interesting about this is there are no elements, so to speak, that you can manipulate. You follow your process, and you get out to a reasonably good outcome. But you might argue we don't know why we got there, how we got there. The only elements I can really identify are kind of in the lower right. There's your user and your designer. That's what we've got. But again, I think we can push ourselves and be a little more granular, find something new. So that was the 1300s to 1600s or thereabout. If we fast forward to the mid-1960s, almost exactly 50 years ago to the day, Walt Disney was recently highlighted in UX magazine as the first user-centered designer of our time. I might argue that the craftsmen from the Renaissance were also user-centered designers. Those who were great were making great products and great things that were easy to use and so forth. But Walt was highlighted as that and was developing some pretty extraordinary experiences. And he was crossing a lot of worlds. He was bringing storytelling to breakthrough movie animation, to physical theme parks, and ultimately to product, and so on. And we have tried to figure out over the years how things like that come to be. How can we traverse those different areas of expertise? And this is one of many, many Venn diagrams. If you search UX Venn, you'll find lots of them. It is generally agreed, as far as I can tell, that we're all getting it wrong, even the folks who are making these Venn diagrams. If you want to start a fight at a UX conference, show something like this. It's not working. So it would be the clue to me to say that we're kind of messing with the wrong things. But Walt was essentially the progenitor of the first creative industrial complex, cradle to grave. Right? It today is an extraordinary force to be reckoned with. And so in addition to those things they were designing, stories and theme parks and so on, were also business models. How did they get there? I wish Peter could be here for this part of the conversation because I owe it to him that I even know what this is, and I suspect he has a fetish for org charts. This was presented in 2012 in his presentation at UX Week. And I'll actually show that in a second, but this is the org chart for Disney at the time in the 60s. And you start to get a sense of how it's possible to pull off a multi-dimensional delivery process when you have to actually take the person who is kind of driving the vision and the ideas out of the center or off the hierarchy of the top and put somebody more in the center who can kind of traffic control and have a vision that is shared but not singularly owned. So I think this is a really interesting kind of insight for how you start to organize around creating something bigger and more multidimensional. But it hasn't been done often. So that was Walt. Let's take a look at one more gentleman from the mid-1960s. His name is Arthur C. Clarke. I posted this video in a recent blog post. But again, if you search something like Arthur C. Clarke predicts the future, you'll see this. And it's worth listening to. But essentially what he's saying is, in order to predict the future, you have to do two things. You have to take what you have in front of you and use it to extend your knowledge. And he's showing the cityscape now as the obvious this is the future, this is clearly going to happen. He then goes on to say that you have to get crazy if you're going to really be effective at predicting a meaningful future. If you're going to get somewhere, you've got to get way out ahead of your audience, so much so that you sound like you're nuts. And look at him, he's getting crazy right now. So he is explaining that clearly within our lifetimes, within 50 years, we will see these cities evolve. And then here's the crazy stuff. We will disconnect communication from a physical location. We'll be able to perform surgery on a person in a different continent from another continent. And at that time, the concept even of a city will cease to exist. In a sidebar, if you take a look at the longer version, he says, I hope we don't turn entirely into a planet of suburbs. That being said, we have to get a little bit nutty here, and so I'm asking your permission as I go a little bit further out into the future. So, Peter, if we look at that Venn diagram, or any others like it, Peter established about a year ago that we were kind of doing it wrong. And in front of a room full of designers, he said, we don't actually live in any one of those circles. Our job is to live in the gaps between those circles. And that's kind of awe-inspiring. And the crowd was very quiet when he said it, because they all want to own their thing, right? But what's really interesting is if you live in your circle and you stay there, you're essentially becoming an expert in product design, whatever product that might be, which is great. That's your medium. If you traverse those circles, and this is me extrapolating, you're essentially getting into service design at that point, right? How do you move from one object or experience to another, and how do you compel somebody to do that, and how do you make sense of it? And things like the journey map that Victor was showing a moment ago are great tools to help figure that out. But he does an interesting thing. He talks about his new job at the time, which was Groupon. And he said, the first thing I did when I got there was I removed the title UX from all of the people who worked for me. I thought that was really profound because it had an effect on the organization. And I thought, well, if you take that UX title away, let's take UX away entirely. And what do you end up with? You end up with what I would call craftsmanship. UX is something well made. And I would suggest that it's fair to replace that acronym with craftsmanship. So therefore, these are Peter's 3 points, and I'm hijacking them. His 3 points are, in my words, craftsmanship is not a department, first and foremost. If it were, that would absolve the rest of the organization from concerning themselves with it, right? You could silo within your specialty. So that's not acceptable. Craftsmanship is a mindset. It's a fundamentally human way of solving problems. And I think that's a very important, profound thing to keep top of mind. Design, UX, whatever you're calling yourself. We solve problems in a fundamentally human way. Again, these are Peter's words. And finally, craftsmanship is an outcome. It's a label that defines a set of experiences relevant to a person, not the other way around. And that's where I think the hint lies. That's where I think we can kind of step to another level, and this is where the crazy starts to happen. So before we get to the crazy, I do want to say I'm not here to say UX is dead. Peter politely left that off of his speech as well. Don't need to be saying anything like that. I'm just saying it's a mindset. So again, if you want to start a fight at a UX conference, start talking about job titles. It's not worth your time. Great design is what's necessary, and that's the purpose of today. So what is the craftsmanship of experience design? We're all designing experiences, whether they're on pixels, whether they're in devices, whether they're crossing pixels and devices, whether we're designing services. I'm also of the mind that design is design. If we're going to perform experience design, we need a set of elements that we don't normally think about. So, what might those be? Space is a component of experience design, and time. is a component of experience design. Now, I would ask, can you design space and can you design time? Arthur would say we're getting a little crazy. So let's relate that. So if you can design space, and I apologize, it's a little small, you could roughly relate that to product. We can design products that live in space. We are in space, and we design things in space. We do environmental design. If we design for time, we're designing services. We're designing the speed that you get through a service. We're designing the friction points that might exist in that service, and so forth. And so those, I think, are the crack. The overwhelming, almost paralyzing element to this thought process is if we are always designing a thing within a system, as somebody said, within a larger context, right? They're always in a larger context, the trash can and the... So that is... Nobody can get their head around how far that can go. You can dive in and dive out of it, and that's a good creative process. But I would suggest you can't arbitrate that. You can't be absolute with it. And a lot of what we've heard today, I think, is inspiring in that you can design for flexibility and resilience, for instance, but you can't design for perfection, which I would agree with. So if we are going to perform experience design, the elements I might suggest, and these are certainly not right, but they're a beginning, could be things like these. Can you design a sense of truth into something? Can you design for space and time? As we start to tinker with these elements, and again, these elements are not the user necessarily and not the interface necessarily. They're the things that might float in between, the tension between those two things. We are the next breed of alchemist. We don't know exactly what these materials are, but I think simply having a hint, simply believing that fire and water and earth could be those things, we're paying attention and we'll find our way from the 4 to the 98 that we have today. This is a table of elements with all the physical things that represent the stuff, the molecules that they present, or the person who found it. What I think is tremendous about this is there is a corollary for us, right? There are wireframes, personas, prototypes, and so forth. These are the things that we work with, and those are all important things for process. There's another level I'm suggesting, which is these human elements, the human condition, that we could start to find. Again, way wrong, probably way off. This will look foolish in a few years. But if you were to start to try to find things that you could be designing for, you might find things like resiliency, as I mentioned, within space, and I'll talk about specifically how or why. You may find, in designing for time, things like cycles, things like velocity, consistency, and so forth. Things we don't think about. So if we think about the journey map that we saw a moment ago, we map it all, right? But how fast am I moving through that? Or how quickly is something coming at me? That's an element of design we're not really thinking about yet. So 2 examples, one too big and one too small, and then drinks. Yes, I was promised there would be alcohol. So our 2 big example. You can design buildings, right? Are there any architects here? No? Okay, that's all right. We'll talk about them then. You can design a building. You can even, quote unquote, fly through that building before it's put into production. You can try certain aspects of the building out for load and other mathematical equations. You can even get to a point where, and we're minutes away from it, where you could hit the equivalent of a print button and print that building, right? I think it's called B2 in Brooklyn, is going up now as the largest modular building in the world. Imagine that. Drones fly in, bring your unit to the building, you've moved. Some other folks move out, the building reconfigures. Hurricane Sandy Part 2 happens. The building itself relocates. Suddenly you have resilience at a level that has never existed in the physical form before. That becomes profound. That is particularly profound when it's under the control of a limited number of people, and when the rest of us are having to kind of grapple with that and make sense of it. My home, in this case, is meaningful to me, and it's how I anchor my perspective on how I live, right? If it's moving around, how does that change my perspective on the world? So, you might take this nascent table of elements and say, well, that model starts to test some of those elements in new ways. So things like, how often does the building change? How much will it stay consistent? Is it more resilient because it's actually mobile? So on and so forth. I'm not saying B2 can get up and walk around, but buildings are heading in this kind of intriguing direction, and designers, all of us, are figuring that kind of stuff out, depending on what field you're in. The example that's too small. So we've seen some examples of micro-interactions and so forth. This is another great summary of some of those. This was in Smashing Magazine fairly recently. And so I don't mean to go through all of these to say these are phenomenal examples of micro-interactions, but it's a good, again, test of how these elements between us and the thing could exist and how you might start to think about them existing. So if you think about velocity and distance, this contextual scroll is providing a sense of context, a sense of place, if you will, as you move through the interface. If there were, and we wouldn't design it, but if there were 20 of these and the scroll was right, you wouldn't do it because the velocity is going to be too much. It'll start to feel frenetic and so forth. The other thought I had before picking these micro-interactions was the emergence of flat design, right? The debate about what, Apple and Android and so forth, everything's flattening out. And there were comments, I guess, again, if you want to start a fight at a design conference, ask about flat versus anthropomorphic. But there's reasoning in the market that says, it's a fad, it's fashion, it'll go back, it'll kind of oscillate, we'll get tired of flat, and so on and so forth. I would argue against that. I was reading that it's a design language, right, that's simplifying because we're overloaded, because we feel frenetic already. And so it's unlikely that that's going to actually revert to more textured designs. This would be an example of that. There was a question earlier on about kind of how do you deal with the information overload if I walk up to my washing machine and so forth. I think this is a great, simple, tiny example of that. If I want to add a comment, I'm presented with a field, but that's all I'm presented with until I engage with it. And then the noise is allowed to increase, right? So noise might be another one of the elements that I haven't included yet. But I think we're designing for essentially these components. Again, pull to see more stuff, right? Your intuition is to continue to scroll. The old web model was hit refresh and more stuff would show up at the bottom. We have to invert it for mobile devices. It's extremely intuitive to pull it down and see if there is more stuff, right? That is giving us a faster, more grounded sense of how we're making our way through an interface. And then finally, and I'm not a big advocate of this, but context-based hiding as you move through a browser, start to get into the content, the components of the browser disappear, right? So that's, again, attempting to reduce noise. So if we start to address, are we doing good? Are we getting there in a good way? These elements of experience design may be hints or clues for how we get there. And if we think in this way, may start to form up in terms of patterns, which we're all very good at identifying, and start to reveal themselves in a more tangible sense. What is this emotional intelligence that people like to talk about, but can't really quantify in a terribly great way? If we're able to do that, if we think about time as an organizing principle in this case, for instance, when TiVo first came out, we were able to bend time in new ways, right? Appointment television was going away. Commercials were at risk, and so on. What if, instead of organizing around mobile design or website design or service design, we organized around the design of time? And you had a time-bending guild, for instance. And those folks were the experts if you had a product where you wanted to actually start to push your product in new ways. So that is essentially the thought on the future, a little bit of crazy, and I'd love to have a conversation about it.
So there's definitely a little bit of crazy in there, but it's my kind of crazy. When you're talking about how products are essentially bending space and services are essentially bending time, don't you think we kind of get into an interesting world where it starts crossing over with physics, with all the information and energy and electricity and matter that we're harnessing to represent these different things and move ourselves around and have all these services? Where do you think this starts intersecting with things I don't understand, like quantum mechanics, if we can talk about that?
Yeah, so I edited myself and pulled the slide about Heisenberg out of the deck because I thought that was really fucking crazy. So one of my favorite theories, and I don't know quantum physics at all, I stopped at Algebra 1, is, again, English major, I love this statement, which apparently is true. In order to perform equations in quantum mechanics, you have to admit that there are gradations of your ability to know the place of the thing or the staticness of the thing or the movement of the thing. The more you know about the movement of the thing, the less you can know about the solidity or stuffness of the thing. So if that's the case, I think that's, again, an interesting clue. So my way in was, I can design applications, I can design services, but I probably can't be expert at both. Some people can, but maybe those are the unicorns that get talked about. Maybe it's not your ability to design a front-end interface in code and pixels and also to be able to do UX. That's one version of a unicorn, but maybe your ability to go big and small is actually product design and service design. Now, to the point of bending, I think we have to find our way through that because we are bending things that we're not really thinking about in terms of unintended consequences. Not saying that we can figure it all out, but we could at least have the discussion before we get there.
I work in the teach video game design, and it seems analogous to what I teach, which is similar. We teach basically camera, control, and character, which would pretty much correspond to space, time, and meaning. So it seems, and then we also very much in the video game industry talk about craftsmanship as well. So it's, I don't necessarily have a question, but it's just an observation because, in video games, the camera, where you put the camera, it really determines how you're dealing with space. And then in terms of the timing, how you control the jump, how fast the character goes up and down, and all those sorts of things in video games are critical elements to deal with. So maybe there's future designers in the video game industry, but I don't know if you have any comments on that.
No, just a quick one. I almost put a piece in here which was about a new kind of breakthrough video game perspective experiment where you're kind of walking through the world and then your character kind of checks his phone or whatever it is. And the way the camera moves in and out and so forth is just utterly brilliant. So I think you're right. There's some great design exploration to be done. But in terms of space, time, and meaning, there's a debate, which I'm sure you're well aware of, around the meaning aspect, as I would categorize it, which is if I can't get my 11-year-old kid off of the video game because he's finding meaning in his life from that video game, we've got a higher philosophical challenge to deal with. And so, when we design addiction into an experience, we have the ability to do that. But when should we, right? If we can design addiction into folding proteins, that's good, right? Because we solve scientific problems. But the converse is a little different.
So you were talking about designing addiction. In our office, we talk a lot about neuroplasticity and designing for neuroplastic games and changes within, our brain structure. Are you interested in that at all, or do you dive into designing addiction or neuroplastic design?
I would call myself a neophyte in that area, but I think it's not discussed enough. So the best I can offer at this point is to raise it, in presentations like this, because I think with product design and everything else, that should be one of the shingles, let's say, in a day like today.
I just wanted to make a comment that connected the video game concept to what you've been describing. I saw recently someone had taken Pac-Man and changed the perspective to make it as though you're seeing through the eyes of Pac-Man, so it was a 3D first-person shooter type thing. And it was the same game, same concept, same characters, but because they made that one change of perspective from top-down to first-person, it was a totally different experience. And so I think that when we're looking at design and things, very, very subtle change can have a dramatic impact on the end product. Yeah.
That's a beautiful point. And I think, they're great. Have you guys heard of like the oblique strategies, which is like a card set for giving yourself a ridiculous challenge, right? Like you only have 30 seconds to live. How are you going to design, right? Brian Eno and some others made these cards up years and years ago, and they just helped them write songs, make better interfaces, and so forth. What I would suggest is some of the elements we're talking about here, again, right or wrong, could be interesting ways to just see a problem totally differently, to your point. Good? Drinks? Yes? Thank you, guys.